There's a story they tell in every corner of ufology. If you've ever picked up a dog-eared paperback about sources and secrets, if you've ever sat up late and let static-filled voices on shortwave radio keep you company, if you've ever found yourself staring at the ceiling, wondering what's really out there, they teach you this story first. Roswell is the first grade of all this. The opening chapter, the shiny apple on the teacher's desk. If you believe the old-timers, Roswell is where it all began, where the modern UFO age put on its Sunday best, climbed onto the front page, and dared the world to explain it away. And maybe that's why, for a lot of us, Roswell feels like a half-remembered bedtime story now. A haze of desert wind and yellowed newspaper clippings. We know the headlines: flying saucer captured, flying saucer denied. And somewhere in the middle, a rancher, a field of wreckage, a handful of men in uniform swearing they didn't see what they saw. It's so famous, so mythic, it becomes almost vague. A cloud of silver foil and secrets, a rumour that got too big to pin down. But how much do you really know? The details, the scraps, the contradictions, the press release that changed its mind overnight, the undertaker's late-night phone call, the nurse who disappeared, the weather balloon that wasn't, or maybe was. Tonight, you've checked in for the night at the Dreamland Motel. The neon flickers, the desert shimmers outside the window. The bar's still open, and a few old guests are drifting in one by one. They say they've got something to share, something they didn't tell the papers back then. Before we get started, make sure you've checked in at the front desk. Consider liking and subscribing if you find value in what we do here. And let us know what you think in the comments down below. The management takes all feedback on board. I myself learned this story so long ago that sitting here tonight, I can't be sure where it will land when we're through. Maybe the ending's the same. Maybe there's a new piece hidden in plain sight. Because for all the times we've dusted off Roswell, it still clings to the edges of what's happening now. New leaks, new claims, new shadows cast by that desert sun in 1947. Where does Roswell sit in 2025? Maybe closer than we like to admit. Maybe it never really left. Let's revisit the facts. Let's open the door to the myths. Welcome to Roswell. Before the confessions come, let's pin down what we do know, briefly, and what kind of world it happened in. It's the summer of 1947. America has been war-free for 2 years, but the shadows of it still stretch long. Out here in New Mexico, there's open range and hard work, cattle fences that never stay mended, storms that roll through without warning. Radios crackle with Benny Goodman, and reports of flying discs spotted over Idaho, over Oregon, over places people still pronounce like they're from somewhere else. The word UFO doesn't exist yet. That comes later. For now, it's saucers, discs, something shiny slipping through post-war skies. Roswell is just another ranching town with an army airfield on the edge of it. The 509th bomb group, the same squadron that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. The world is bigger than it was before, but out here the land still hums the same old tune. Dry wind, dirt roads, small talk at the diner. Then a rancher finds something in the dirt. Foil, sticks, rubber. He shows the sheriff, who shows the army, who shows the world. For a moment, what might be the first real glimpse of something not from here. Headlines: Flying disc captured. By the next sunrise, flying disc denied. They say it was a balloon, a mistake, a misunderstanding. The desert goes quiet again, but the whispers never really stop. Years pass, stories grow. The rancher, the intelligence officer, the undertaker, the bodies, the autopsy reels, the Cold War projects stamped top secret in fading ink. That's the skeleton, the simple version. But paper doesn't breathe. Paper doesn't come sit at the motel bar when the lights get low. So tonight, let's hear from the people who did. The door swings open. Mac Brazel's boots scuff the floor. Out past the last windmill, 1947, lives on. William Ware Mac Brazel, 48 years old that summer, ran sheep on the J.B. Foster Ranch, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, closer to Corona than anywhere else. His ranch house had no phone, no electricity, no running water. Just Mac, fence posts that needed mending, and sheep that needed pushing where the water ran. He wasn't the type to chase stories. By every account, Mac minded his own fences and let the world mind its own sky. His wife, Maggie, and their kids, Vernon and Bessie, stayed down in Tularosa, nearly 100 miles away. Mac worked alone most weeks, thunder rolling off the plains, and the wind scraping his door at night. He always said it started with a storm. Late June, maybe early June, depending which version you catch. A hard thunderstorm over the open range that left behind more than rain. In the Roswell Daily Record on July 9th, 1947, Mac said he found the wreckage around June 14, after that storm. But that date never sat right. Tommy Tyree, a young ranch hand who worked on and off for Mac, remembered the real problem. The sheep wouldn't cross the debris field. Whatever it was, foil, sticks, scraps of rubber, or something else, it spooked the flock stiff. Every time Mac tried to drive them across to water, they panicked. He had to lead them wide, circle them miles out into the desert heat that doesn't forgive such foolishness, just to make sure they didn't die from dehydration. Any rancher worth his salt clears junk fast if it blocks the stock. Summer sun in eastern New Mexico doesn't wait for you. If that wreckage sat out there for 3 weeks, like Mac told the paper, then he risked the sheep, the wool, and his own paycheck. It makes more sense that he found the wreck far later than mid-June, maybe around July 2nd or 3rd, when the country was already cracking the stories of flying discs in the papers. On July 7th, Mac loaded scraps into his old pickup and rattled 75 miles into Roswell. He brought them to Sheriff George Wilcox. foil that wouldn't crease, rubber strips that didn't burn, sticks like kite frame. He said, "Sheriff, I might have found one of them flying discs." Wilcox called Roswell Army Airfield. The base sent out Major Jesse Marcel, intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group, the only atomic squadron in the country, and Captain Sheridan Cavett, Army counterintelligence. They followed Mac back up the washboard roads to see the debris field for themselves. That night, Marcel and Cavett stayed at Mac's ranch house. They laid out scraps on the kitchen floor under a bare bulb. They tried to make sense of it. Mac had seen weather balloons before, found plenty tangled on fence wire over the years, but this didn't look like that. Before the army clamped the lid shut, Mac sat down at KGFL, the local Roswell radio station. Walt Whitmore, the station's owner, helped him record an interview, a wire recording, Mac describing what he saw. But that tape never aired. The army got to him first. The FCC, so the story goes, called Whitmore's office and made it plain. Broadcast it, lose your license. By the next morning, Mac was under military guard. The Roswell Daily Record ran his story on July 9th under the headline, "Harassed Rancher Who Located Saucer, Sorry He Told About It." The Army's new version said it was just a weather balloon, and there was Mac, under escort, repeating what he'd been told to say. But tucked into the very same interview, Mac slipped the truth back in. He said he'd found weather balloons before. Then, flat out, "I am sure that what I found was not any weather observation balloon." Same article, same breath, contradiction sitting there in black and white. He also told the reporter, "If I find anything else besides a bomb, they are going to have a hard time getting me to say anything about it." Not a throwaway line. A man saying he'd been shut up once and wasn't about to risk it twice. Before the army got hold of him, Mac couldn't stop talking. Floyd and Loretta Proctor, neighbours near Corona, said he drove around showing scraps to anyone who'd look. Afterward, they'd see him in Roswell, MPs on either side, and he'd look right through them like he never knew their names. His son, Bill Jr., told it plain. They put him in jail for about a week. When he came back, he wouldn't say a thing. His daughter Bessie remembered the same secrets. "We were told not to talk about this at all." Frank Joyce, the KGFL radio man, later swore Mac pulled him aside and whispered, "They told me to say this, or it would go awfully hard on me, and you." So what was it? The scraps were foil, sticks, rubber, just like a weather balloon or a radar kite from Project Mogul, if you take the government's word. Or maybe something stranger, that didn't blow away as easily as the story did. Mac Brazel never gave another interview. He quit the ranch not long after, ran a meat packing plant down in Las Cruces, and died in 1963. Plain grave, plain stone. A rancher who found something he shouldn't have, said it once, and spent the rest of his days hoping nobody would make him say it again. But the hush didn't stay on the ranch. It rode into Roswell in the back of a truck. Scraps of foil and sticks handed over to a man in uniform whose job was to know what was worth covering up and what wasn't. Major Jesse Marcel took it from there, carried it through the base gates, posed for photos he'd regret, and spent the next 30 years deciding if he'd stay quiet too. He didn't. Not forever. He's waiting at the bar now. Same foil, same story, different ending. Major Marcel's next. Marcel was the man who took Mac Brazel's scraps out of the ranch truck and carried them into history. As I previously stated, at the time Marcel was the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group at Roswell Army Airfield. He'd flown weather recon over the Pacific, trained in photo intelligence, knew every radar target and balloon the military used at the time, or so he thought. On July 7th, Sheriff Wilcox called the base and handed off Mac Brazel's story. Colonel Blanchard sent Marcel and Captain Sheridan Cavett into the dust to see what the rancher had found. Marcel said later he could still feel the rough road under the Jeep tires when they pulled up on that stretch of pasture. Scattered over the field, pieces as far as the fence ran. Foil, balsa-like sticks, rubber strips, parchment or plastic that wouldn't tear the way it should have done. They stayed out there for hours. Mac told them his sheep wouldn't cross it. Marcel would say years later that it looked like something had exploded in the air. He and Cavett packed what they could fit. Some say they left plenty behind. The next morning, back in Roswell, Marcel was too curious and too proud of what he'd found not to share it at home. He stopped at his own house, woke his wife and his 11-year-old son, Jesse Jr. They spread the same foil and sticks across their own kitchen table. Jesse Jr. would never forget it. The shiny foil that flattened but wouldn't crease. The thin beams stamped with strange purple symbols, like hieroglyphs, he'd say decades later. After this, Marcel loaded the debris into his car and brought it to the base. Colonel Blanchard saw it, said they'd found something big, and sent out the press release that changed everything. Quote, "The many rumours regarding the flying discs became a reality yesterday, when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc." Marcel's name went on the press release. His hands were on the pieces. He was the man who found the first captured flying saucer. But it didn't stay his story for long. Within hours, Marcel was ordered to fly the wreckage to Fort Worth Army Airfield, to General Roger Ramey's office. That's where the famous photos were taken. Marcel crouched beside scraps of foil and balsa rods, pointing at a weather balloon spread out on the carpet like a child's broken kite. For the cameras, Marcel did his duty. He didn't say much. Ramey did the talking. It's a weather balloon. End of story. Except Marcel never really believed that. Not then and not later. Decades on, when the world had nearly forgotten Roswell, Marcel told the other side. First to Stanton Friedman in 1978, then on TV, then to the National Enquirer, then to anyone who'd listen. It was not anything made by us. It was not made on this earth. He said the photos in Ramey's office were staged, swapped out scraps to kill the headline. The real material, the foil that sprang back smooth, the beams with symbols, never saw daylight again. He said he wanted his grandchildren to know he hadn't confused a radar kite with a spaceship. His son backed him up. Jesse Marcel Jr. told the same story for the rest of his life. That the foil spread on their kitchen table didn't behave like anything ordinary. That the beams were stamped with symbols he could never forget. That his father always said the army covered up what they really found. Some believed Marcel, a decorated intel officer turned radio repairman, a man with nothing to gain but the truth. Some didn't. Skeptics pointed out that he never said a word for 30 years. They dug through his records and found exaggerations. They said he might have built the myth bigger in old age. But they couldn't erase what he did say, plain as day, when he finally shared his secrets. That the wreckage on that ranch wasn't weather gear, wasn't spy gear, was something else. And that the photos they showed the world were just a magician's sleight of hand. Marcel died in 1986. By then, Roswell was rolling back onto the world's front page, stitched together by authors and TV specials and late-night calls from people who wanted to know if he'd really seen what he said he saw. The photos stayed, so did the hush, but Jesse Marcel's voice cracked it, just enough to let the wind back in. Next up at the bar, the son who stood barefoot in the kitchen when the foil touched the table. The boy who kept that memory sharp for 60 more years. Some memories are more ingrained in us than anything we learn in school. Jesse Antoine Marcel Jr. was 11 years old the night his father woke him up in the early hours and told him to come and see something in the kitchen. By the time the story broke over the front page, flying disc captured, Jesse Jr. was just a name in the background. He grew up, went to medical school, learned to stitch wounds and read x-rays. He flew rescue helicopters in Vietnam, pinned his own wings, raised a family, became a colonel in the Montana National Guard. A man with his own clearances, his own secrets, none of which ever shook loose the one thing he held tight, what he saw on the linoleum that summer in Roswell. He told the story the same way for 60 years. It never got bigger, it never shrank. His father came home after that long drive from the Foster Ranch with foil and sticks packed into his Jeep. Jesse Sr. was proud, maybe a little excited, told his wife, Vi, and their boy to come take a look. There it was, foil spread out, shards of thin wood or beams, and a piece that looked like a small metal I-beam with violet or purplish symbols stamped down the side. Like hieroglyphs, Jesse Jr. said, but no language he could recognize. He touched the foil, crumpled it in his hands. It wouldn't stay creased. He laid it flat. It smoothed out like water. He tapped the beam, light but strong, too light for wood. His dad didn't say alien, didn't say weather balloon either, just that it was not anything made by us. After spending some time examining it, the debris rode off in a base jeep, and the boy watched his father vanish into official photos in General Ramey's office, kneeling beside scraps that looked like kite sticks and torn rubber. The real pieces never came back. Years went by. Jesse Jr. wore a uniform of his own. He flew with the 71st EVAC in Vietnam, the same unit made famous by medevac pilots who pulled wounded soldiers off the jungle floor under fire. In the early 2000s, well past retirement age, he went to Iraq as a flight surgeon. Same eyes, same story. He told anyone who asked, "I know what I saw. I handled it myself." He said the symbols were burned in his mind, the violet marks on brushed metal. He drew them over and over for UFO investigators. Always the same rough pattern, lines, dots, curls, like half-finished glyphs. Never tried to say they were words, just that they were there. When skeptics asked if a boy of 11 might misremember a scrap of radar kite or foil from a fancy balloon, he said the same thing every time. My dad wanted me to see it, because he knew it wasn't ordinary. And if his father hadn't spoken up in the 70s, Jesse Jr. probably wouldn't have either. He didn't go looking for cameras, they came to him. He signed affidavits, gave talks at UFO conventions, testified under oath at the citizen hearing in 2013. Always the same line. It was not made by us. When he died that same year, in his sleep at 76, they found books on UFOs spread open on the bed beside him. Some said he was still looking for a final piece that made sense of what he'd touched. Maybe he was. Maybe it never needed sense, just memory. He was the boy who saw the foil that wouldn't crease, the beam that shouldn't have been stamped the way it was. Jesse Marcel Jr. kept his father's secrets alive. Next at the bar, the other shadows in this story. The men who said they saw more than foil. The ones who spoke of crates in back hangars, of bodies under tarps, of a desert where the wind was never the strangest thing that moved. The cleanup crew. If you wanted to keep a secret in 1947, you didn't need cameras or wiretaps. You needed tired young men in uniform, standing guard, following orders, not asking too many questions. They called it the cleanup crew, the men who roped off the desert and brought the pieces home under canvas tarps and flickering headlamps. Some were just base grunts, cooks, privates, transport techs, plucked from chow lines and barracks bunks and told, "Gear up, you didn't see this." Private First Class Elias Benjamin. That wasn't his real name when the story first surfaced, but the rank and face were real enough. He said they pulled him off an overnight security shift at the 390th Air Service Squadron. Top secret clearance, standard for anyone guarding atomic bombers, out at Roswell Army Airfield. They told him to report to Hangar P3. Inside, commotion, MPs on edge. A ranking officer pale and mumbling before being hustled away. Benjamin got handed a short, sharp order. Help move stretchers to the base hospital. The convoy rolled slow across the tarmac in the dawn hours. The story goes that one sheet slipped back just long enough. Greyish skin, swollen head, dark slanted eyes. Not a training dummy, not a burned pilot, not human. Benjamin said he saw it breathe just once. He held that moment for decades, told no one but his wife, then spoke to a quiet tape recorder for Thomas Carey 50 years later. There was something under that sheet that shouldn't have been there. Then there was Melvin Brown, an army cook by his paperwork. But like any good mess sergeant, you did what you were told. When the base scrambled every warm body to the ranch, Brown said yes like any other man with stripes to protect. His daughters told the world later what he whispered when the papers started printing weather balloon stories. I rode in the back of a truck from out there. We peeked under the tarp. There were bodies. Beverly Brown said her father described small frames, no bigger than a child's casket, heads too large, eyes wrong, skin the colour of old parchment. Brown said he guarded the hangar when they boxed them up, heard the clatter of dry ice being shovelled in. He never put this in writing, but his last words, when cancer hollowed him down in 1986, circled back to Roswell one final time. Sergeant Homer Rowlett waited 40 years before telling his son what he'd done. He worked the 603rd Air Engineering Squadron. In his last week alive, he told his son Larry he'd been out on the Foster Ranch too, collecting material that wouldn't crease and watching men slip shapes into crates. He said he saw 3 small figures laid out where the desert scrub cut away. One was alive. Another name in the same unit, Master Sergeant Harry Telesco, told his family nearly the same thing. His daughter said he came back different that week, never quite looked people in the eye when they asked what he did in 47. On the nights he talked, he said, "I saw it too. The little people. One survived." If you follow the convoy down the runway, you find Flight Engineer Robert Porter. His affidavit sits in archives today. He says he helped load a B-29 with brown paper packages and 1 large triangular piece. The crew was told flying saucer parts. When they landed in Fort Worth, a general staged the famous photo with kite sticks and weather balloon foil. The real cargo got shuffled off onto another plane bound for Dayton. And Porter spent the next 40 years telling anyone who asked, there was no balloon. Even Sheriff Wilcox, the civilian in the chain, ended up under guard. His widow told their granddaughter that MPs came knocking with quiet threats. They told the sheriff if he ever spoke out of turn, the cost wouldn't stop at him. They'd kill the family too. Same talk echoed in the base hospital where the convoy ended. 1 enlisted man, 1 chaplain, even the undertaker in town claimed to hear whispers of what lay under the sheets. Child-sized coffins, orders for dry ice, men in plain suits with polished shoes, and nowhere to be found in the base roster once the debris vanished. When the Air Force finally dusted off the files in the 90s, they labelled this as confusion. Dummy drops, crashed planes years later, memories folded into each other like old letters in a shoebox. They said the bodies were mannequins, and the faces, along with the oversized almond-shaped eyes, were parachutists in goggles. But for the men on guard duty that week, the tarps were never blank canvas. The convoy rolled quiet under a desert sky that didn't care what secrets people tried to bury. And long after the trucks cleared the gate, some of those young men lay awake, wondering what they'd really watched slip by on a stretcher. Next at the motel bar, the man who ran the phones when the base hospital called for coffins too small for grown men. The local undertaker, who learned you don't always want the customer to be right when the army comes asking questions. The start of some secrets can be as innocuous as a phone ringing in the back of a small-town funeral home. In the summer of 47, Glenn Dennis was 22, newly trained and just trying to keep up with the calls at Ballard Funeral Home. Roswell wasn't much then. Dusty streets, a base that ran on quiet orders, and a mortician who knew every family name from town to ranch gate. Dennis always said that it began with a call from Roswell Army Airfield Hospital. A voice on the line wanted to know, did Ballard carry child-size caskets? Not just any coffins, hermetically sealed. Dennis said he paused, checked his notes. 3'6", bronze. They could get them by morning. The base wanted to know more. How to preserve bodies found out in the open. No refrigeration, maybe days in the desert heat. How do you clean something like that up? Dennis thought it odd, but not yet strange. The Air Force lost men sometimes. Accidents, fires. But child-sized. He didn't ask too many questions, not yet. Later that day, Dennis was called to drive an injured airman out to the base hospital. He said he parked near the ambulance dock and walked into something he wasn't supposed to see. 3 army ambulances backed up to the doors, rear gates open. Inside, metal debris stacked on stretchers, dull silver, edges sharp as glass. One piece, Dennis always said, caught the light, bluish purple, shaped like the belly of a canoe, marked with symbols that reminded him of, quote, Egyptian hieroglyphs. He stepped inside. He said he found a nurse he knew, young, red hair tucked under a cap. Her eyes said, "Leave now." But before she could say more, a voice stopped him cold. A red-headed officer, in crisp uniform, not one Dennis recognized, blocked the hall. The way Dennis told it later, the man leaned in close, voice like ice under the desert sun. You didn't see anything. You don't go into town making up stories. You don't talk to anyone about this. Dennis, stubborn as any young man in a funeral coat, told him, I'm a civilian. You can't tell me what to do. The officer didn't flinch. Oh yes, we can. If you open your mouth, somebody will be picking your bones out of the sand. Another sergeant standing by added, I'll make dog food out of you. Dennis turned and walked out with the air around his shoulders heavier than the desert heat. The next day, he said, the nurse slipped him a message. They met at the officers' club. She'd seen it, she'd told him. 3 small bodies, laid out under bright lights. Doctors whispering over their shoulders. Mangled, burned, the smell of chemicals still clinging to her uniform. She drew him a quick sketch. Narrow shoulders, oversized heads, eyes too big, tiny mouths, like a cut line. A rough diagram on a napkin that Dennis said he kept in his mind for 50 years. Not long after that, she was gone. Transferred overseas, he claimed. London first, then the trail went dead. A letter he mailed her came back unopened, stamped in black, deceased. The nurse's name? He told researchers years later it was Naomi Self. No record of her was ever found. When that cracked, he changed it to Naomi Sipes. That name vanished into army rosters too. Nothing. Not even a paper slip. When Dennis finally spoke out in 1989, he said he'd kept the secret because the threat was real, and because in Roswell, some people didn't want the old ghosts stirred up. But once he started talking, he didn't stop. He gave lectures, TV interviews, co-founded the Roswell UFO Museum with Walter Holt. He became the undertaker who called in the flying saucer bodies. He told the child casket story again and again. Always the same metal, same phone ringing in an empty prep room. Perhaps predictably, the Air Force didn't buy it. When they cracked open Roswell's files in the 90s, they called Dennis's timeline sloppy. They said his nurse never served. They matched the tiny bodies to dummy drops that didn't happen until years later, or to crash victims from entirely different mishaps. They wrote it off as rumour, half memory. Old men trying to make sense of a rumour that had already grown bigger than them. Even some UFO researchers began to step back. Kevin Randall, who first sat down with Dennis in 1990, later said the contradictions were too much. The nurse that never was, the letter that never turned up, the story that shifted with every new question. But in Roswell, the museum Dennis helped build still stands, a place where the phone still rings for people looking for child-sized coffins that never came. Some called him a liar. Some called him the only man brave enough to speak up. Maybe he was both, or neither. Just a small-town mortician who answered a call one afternoon and found himself in a story that never quite let him go. Next at the bar? Maybe it's time we step outside the gate for a moment. Take in what the generals thought, what the newsmen typed, what the skeptics said when the first flying saucer headline hit the wire. A bigger picture, for a myth too big to stay locked in the back room. The press and the brass next. You can almost hear the typewriters clacking in the newsroom, chasing something bigger than a cattle rustler's fence line. July 8th, 1947. Roswell Daily Record headline wide enough to paste on every diner wall in town. Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The words did their job. The phone lines sparked. Editors barked for copy, and somewhere on the front stoop, a newsboy flipped the pages open and wondered what the old men on Main Street would say when they read it. Major Marcel's name was right there, the Army's own intelligence officer, bringing back scraps of foil and sticks that no one at the ranch could quite explain. The Army Airfield's official press release spelled it out. The rumours of flying discs became reality when the 509th Bomb Group got their hands on one. For one brief summer afternoon, America really did think that saucers might be real, and they'd come down in New Mexico dust. When the phone rang in Fort Worth, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commanding officer of the 8th Air Force, wasn't about to let a local colonel in Roswell start a stampede he couldn't fence in. He called for Marcel, summoned reporters, and laid out a fresh story on the floor of his office. The famous photo. Marcel kneeling on a low rug beside torn sticks, crinkled foil, a cheap radar target that looks like a child's kite in pieces. Ramey pointed at the mess and said, "Weather balloon." Next photo, Colonel Thomas DuBose, Ramey's chief of staff, standing by, arms folded. The new headline spun faster than a tumbleweed. Flying disc turns out to be a weather balloon. The story flipped in under 24 hours. The same base that bragged it held a captured saucer now said the rancher had found nothing but sticks and foil meant for high-altitude weather tests. Mac Brazel was in the back room under watch, repeating that it was just a weather balloon. The same Major Marcel, who showed his son metal that wouldn't crease, was now posing for a staged shot with balsa wood and a radar kite. A quick fix to keep the wires calm. And the person holding that balsa wood would later go on to say that the real debris was gone by the time the flashbulbs popped. The newspapers printed both sides like gospel, front page certainties with no middle ground. Flying saucer today, nothing but rubber and sticks tomorrow. By the time the week ended, the army said the flying disc never existed. The story had folded itself back into the desert wind. Some people swallowed the balloon story whole and asked for seconds. Some never bought it for a minute. But that quick reversal, the headline, the photograph, the silence in Marcel's eyes as he pointed at something he knew wasn't the real wreckage, that's where the Roswell myth got its backbone. One contradiction wide open, one photo staged to patch it shut. The brass got their version printed, of course. The press got their front page. The ranch stayed quiet. And the question left behind was simple. If it was really nothing, why dress it up at all? Next at the bar, the believers who kept that question alive when the desert heat cooled. The skeptics who said it was never anything, and the reason Roswell became the first stop on the road to every flying saucer story that came after. For 3 decades, Roswell mostly slept. A headline clipped and yellowed in dusty scrapbooks. A local rumour whispered over coffee at the Woolworth's lunch counter. If you'd asked the 1950s what the first flying saucer crash was, most folks wouldn't say Roswell. They'd say Kenneth Arnold's sighting near Mount Rainier, or Adamski's desert photos, or saucers filmed skipping like stones. The desert story faded, buried under bigger Cold War shadows. Then, in 1978, a nuclear physicist named Stanton Friedman knocked on Jesse Marcel's door. Friedman had heard the old intelligence officer still had something to get off his chest. Marcel told him the same thing he'd quietly told his friends for years. It wasn't any weather balloon. It was not made by us. That single taped interview cracked the vault. Friedman ran with it. Lectures, late-night radio shows, book deals. The first real book to shout cover-up was The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore in 1980. Berlitz, a master of the Bermuda Triangle bestsellers, gave Roswell a new pulse, a flying saucer, a military retrieval, and bodies, the part the headlines never printed. By the mid-1980s, Kevin Randall and Don Schmitt started pulling more threads. They chased down MPs, rancher families, flight engineers, and Glenn Dennis's undertaker calls. They gathered names and whispered confessions, building out a tapestry stitched together by contradictions and half-memories. A crash here, bodies there, metal that folded itself smooth. The case grew bigger than Marcel and Brazel ever imagined. The International UFO Museum opened in Roswell in '91. The myth of the crash retrieval, the secret hangars, the preserved aliens, the hidden files at Wright-Patterson, took its seat at the center of modern UFO lore. But as the story spread, it split. Carl Flock, a former intelligence officer himself, dug deep and called it folklore. He said real evidence pointed to Project Mogul, a top-secret balloon meant to eavesdrop on Soviet nuclear tests. The foil, the sticks, the odd rubber, all consistent with radar reflectors, high-altitude mic gear the ranchers weren't cleared to know about. Flock's Roswell inconvenient facts stacked the witness contradictions side by side, daring believers to say which version to trust. Cal Korff, the sharp-edged skeptic, called it worse. A mass hallucination turned money machine. He wrote that the main witnesses mixed decades-old gossip with UFO pop culture until nobody could untangle where the ranch ended and the hangar stories began. The Air Force weighed in twice. Once in 1994 with the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction, and again in 1997 with Case Closed. They too pointed at the Mogul program. They pointed at high-altitude dummy drops from the 1950s that witnesses might have blurred backward into 47. They laid it out page by page. No flying disc, no aliens, no secrets, just Cold War spy tech and human imagination filling in the rest. Stanton Friedman fought this explanation to his last day. He called the balloon story nonsense, an insult to the veterans who carried the debris on kitchen floors and under base floodlights. Kevin Randall, even while admitting the inconsistencies, kept Roswell alive in print and on TV, his tone sometimes shifting from believer to skeptic and back again. And that's the trick of Roswell. The myth and the break live side by side. The same room holds believers who speak of sealed hangars and desert threats, and skeptics who cross out witness names like pencil lines on a classified file. In the end, the ranch is still empty. The headlines still hang framed on the museum walls downtown. The same old photos of Marcel in General Ramey's office still spark arguments in back rooms and late-night forums. Some say if you stand in the right corner of the archive, you can still hear Marcel whisper, "It wasn't ours." And what does it mean now? The new whispers, the hearings on Capitol Hill, the talk of crash retrievals that sound too much like old ghosts in modern uniforms. The legacy that won't quite lie down and go to sleep. Roswell is the story that never leaves. It drifts behind the new ones like static on an old radio. A word here, a whisper there, a shape under canvas that nobody wants to name out loud. Roswell is that shape. The first match lit in the desert wind. The line in the record that still skips every time someone says, "crash retrieval." In the summers of hearings and leaks that followed, 2021, 23, and 24, the name stayed just behind the microphone. Congress asked about UAPs, not flying saucers. They asked David Grush what he knew. Multi-decade programs, non-human biologics, secret vaults of things that don't belong to us. Grush never said Roswell outright, but the room heard it anyway. Representatives invoked it. Roswell to Jacksonville. Roswell since 1947. Roswell as the ghost at the committee door. When the question turns to where the story starts, the answer circles the same fence line every time. Luis Elizondo, who once ran it.We, finally put it in ink. In his memoir, Imminent, he wrote it flat. 4 deceased non-human bodies from the crash in 47. Roswell's myth nailed to the back of a page. No wink, no half-step. It's one line that pulls a desert dawn into a Pentagon hallway 75 years later. Some, like Knapp and Corbell, keep that first myth alive every time a new leak slides into the light. They say the story didn't die in the headlines. It crawled underground and became the mold for every file marked too secret to declassify. They call Roswell the blueprint, the seed, the first slip, the first patch-up job the brass ever staged. Others push back harder now than ever. The Air Force's old case closed stamp still holds its place in the Arrow reports. Project Mogul, a lost balloon. No bodies, no saucer. The Pentagon's latest UAP files roll out bland as policy memos. Sensors, radar hits, aerial clutter. Roswell sits on their pages only as a footnote to remind them how rumours are born. And yet, the truth feels sticky under the edges. Whistleblowers don't say Roswell by name, but they speak of legacy craft, hidden vaults, wreckage handed down behind badge clearances and corporate handshakes. If you listen sideways, the shape is the same. The ranch fence, the debris, the phone ringing in the mortician's back room, asking for child-sized coffins nobody wants to explain. No paper trail has ever cracked open the vault. No smoking gun file. The declassified scraps keep the story in limbo. Affidavits, denials, new testimony that sounds like old ghosts walking the same corridor. For me, one line from 1947 keeps echoing. Flying saucer captured, Army Air Force, then weather balloon, then nothing. And so it loops. So here we are, all these decades later, still swapping the same phrases. Crash retrieval, non-human biologics, cover story, national security. Roswell lingers because it taught everyone how the game works. Say something big, walk it back fast, and trust that half the world will keep wondering what never made it back into the evidence box. Maybe Grush was right. Maybe the Legacy program started that summer in 47 and never stopped. Maybe it's still just a myth with good legs. But either way, the motel keeps the light on for it. The fence line's still there. The desert's still quiet if you stand very still. And the story, for now, remains right where it began, waiting for the next knock at the door. Maybe you've wondered this whole time if something truly fell out of the sky that July, metal that bent wrong, bodies that didn't belong here. Where did it all go? The easy answer is the Air Force locked it up. But locked up where? If you follow the old maps, you'll find the same names whispered again and again. Some say the first stop was Wright Field, later Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. That's where Marcel said the real crates went once the desert was cleared. Wright-Pat's Hangar 18. the vault room of UFO lore, became the rumour's address. Crates slid into underground labs, engineers poking at alloy scraps they couldn't quite replicate. By the 50s, the rumour says pieces split off. Some stayed under Air Force roofs, some were shuffled into new branches, Rand Corporation think tanks, private labs with no FOIA trail to tug loose. A few researchers like to point at Battelle Memorial Institute, just down the road from Wright Pat, the lab that worked on exotic metals, shape memory alloys that sound an awful lot like the foil Mac Brazel once pinched between his fingers. No paper ever proved it, but it shows up every few years, like static in the archives. Then there's the bodies, that part people argue about more than any twisted scrap of foil. Some say they went with the wreckage to Wright Pat. Others say they moved again, to bigger, darker vaults on bases like Fort Detrick, or deep freeze hangars on the Nevada ranges, where Groom Lake was still mostly just dry salt and a fence line nobody watched too closely. The whispers say at least one was alive, a creature no taller than a child, skin like soft ash, head too large to hold up on its own. Some versions put it in a base hospital bed for days, even weeks, fed by IV drips, studied by men in suits. A few researchers say those early days taught us more than we admit. Radiation exposure, tissue study, questions about where it came from, and whether there were more. And when the atomic hush grew too tight for the old Air Force to guard alone, the private sector stepped in. Aerospace giants, shadow contracts. Bigelow Aerospace comes up in the footnotes, a name that drifts into Skinwalker Ranch if you flip too many pages. A few say the chain of custody went corporate because private vaults don't answer to those FOIA letters. All of this, true, rumour, half forgotten. Hard to pin down when the original fence line vanished under 50 years of desert wind and declassified excuses. But the shape's still there if you look. So where do we go from here? The same places the story might have gone. Wright-Patterson's archives. The DIA's folders stamped special access only. The contractors who build craft nobody talks about, who file patents for metamaterials that sound suspiciously like the debris. Watch the names that keep surfacing. The new whistleblowers who say crash retrievals still exist. The committee rooms where congressmen accidentally say Roswell on live mic. The Defense Department memos that list legacy programs but never quite define them. The black budgets hidden in plain sight in annual spending bills. If the truth shows up, it might leak through one of those seams first. Or maybe it never will. Maybe it's just a story now. The myth that built the modern flying saucer age and taught us to squint at the desert sky and wonder what doesn't add up. But maybe if you stand on that fence line, the same one Mac Brazel rode out to check for storm damage, you might hear a clue drift back in the wind. Not a flying disc, not a weather balloon, just the open question: where did it all go? And if you ever find an answer, you know where to come tell it. There's always a room waiting here. Before you pack your bag, before the sign flickers out, I'll leave you with this, my own thoughts, scratched on the motel's last page for the night. Roswell, to me, is a story that sticks because it's got everything a good ghost needs. A quiet desert, a sudden crash, animals too scared to move, men in trucks rolling in under cover of rain, and a truth that never made it back out in daylight. Some people call it the gateway. I don't much like that word. Makes it sound like a cheap hook to harder secrets. But maybe it is. Maybe Roswell is the first time you see how far a good story can stretch when a few facts refuse to sit still. People say weather balloon. People say Project Mogul. People say, like Annie Jacobsen once said, that it was all some twisted Soviet trick, a horror show planted to spook America into chasing shadows. I don't buy that. I don't buy a lot of tidy explanations dressed up as closure. What I trust more than any white paper or dusty press clip is what people tell their children when nobody's recording. Fathers telling sons what they carried in the back of a truck under canvas. Wives whispering what the brass said if they talked too much. Stories handed down. That's older than the written word. That's how real knowledge lives when the paper trail's been burned. It's a mother's fingerprint on the timeline, a father's last word before the casket closes. If there's truth left in Roswell, it lives there, in families who didn't bury it deep enough. And here's what makes it different. It's not even the first crash. It's just the first one big enough, weird enough, public enough to stick its name to every cheap UFO joke since. But under the punchlines, there's that one line nobody can scrub out. July 8th, 1947. Roswell Army Airfield captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. That happened. The Army printed it. The front page ran it. Then they walked it back and never looked over their shoulder. So Roswell became the blueprint. The first lesson in how you keep secrets when you don't trust the public to handle new power. And here we are, nearly 80 years on, peering through the same keyholes. We can talk to our congresspeople. We can file our FOIA requests. But the real gatekeepers, they don't sit in office chairs under bright lights. They sit in boardrooms, private labs, halls where clearances outlast presidents. Eisenhower saw it coming. 1961. He stood before the country he'd led through war and warned us. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. He didn't say it lightly. He'd seen the machine grow teeth, contractors, lobbyists, secret deals that never reached a ballot box. He knew that once you mix power with profit, the lock on the vault never rusts, and when that vault holds a piece of something not ours, maybe metal from another civilization, maybe a secret about who else shares the night sky, you better believe that lock stays shut. So maybe Roswell's gift isn't the wreckage or the headlines. Maybe it's the lesson. Belief doesn't need the government's seal of approval. The truth can bypass that kind of authority, passed down like a father's nod, a mother's hush, a quiet whisper that says, "Remember this," even when they tell you to forget. Maybe more stories like this will eventually come to light. Maybe even right here, for the first time, at the Dreamland Motel. Before you go, here's one last match to light if you want to keep digging. Brigadier General Thomas DuBose, General Ramey's Chief of Staff, stood right there in the famous debris photos taken in Fort Worth, Texas, the day they changed the story. In 1991, he said it flat. The weather balloon explanation for the material was a cover story to divert the attention of the press. Once again, thank you for staying with us tonight at the Dreamland Motel. If you liked wandering through the desert with us, leave a comment, share it with someone who still wonders, and don't forget to check back in next time. There's always another room, always another secret, another story waiting for you under the neon. Sleep tight.